Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of the nonfiction that I've completed lately. I think this scarf is overkill, I'm going to take this off. Alright. Essentially by fluke, a couple of the things that I've read recently ended up being basically pairings with each other. I mentioned during the library haul that I was in the middle of reading Paul M. Cobb's The Race for Paradise, An Islamic History of the Crusades, but I had earlier been listening to the audio version of Thomas Asbridge's The Crusades, An Authoritative History of the War for the Holy Land. The audio version is read by Derek Perkins. Now, the Asbridge book is a much broader overview because it is looking at the entirety of all of the wars that were under the Crusades umbrella, which is a much broader piece than I think a lot of people realize. Often when you look in pop culture, people have a mixture of the siege of Jerusalem in the First Crusade plus Templar uniforms, which is later, and so the history is not great, for which we can blame, I don't know, Assassin's Creed and Resurrection Earthreal and like, Kingdom of Heaven and I don't know, every other portrayal of the Crusades in history, basically. A lot of the pop culture is not very accurate. In any case, this one is slightly more narrow just because it is limiting the source material a little bit more, but it is still quite a broad overview, which was essentially what I was looking for because I had listened to a couple of essays, one specifically on French history between the times of Clovis and Napoleon, and then one on Seljuk and early Ottoman history, which both touch on this. So it was interesting to get a slightly deeper dive into that specific area, but it is still both pretty broad. However, if you're looking for an overview on the Crusades, I think these are both quite good. They do get into a lot of the ways in which the kind of modern framing of the Crusades is essentially all propaganda, but it's propaganda that's been evolving over 500 years. And 1,000 years ago, it was very different because it is not simply a single invasion, because you do have in the First Crusade both the Franks on the one side and the Seljuks on the other side are both invading. And the locals are both Christians and Muslims and other religions floating around there. So both of these pay more attention to the nuance of that, as well as the sectarian differences that are leading to other wars that at the time would have been put under the same umbrella, but aren't now because it tends to be framed as this very dramatic specific religious battle, which is not always what it was. There were a lot of land claims and just general power struggles going on. So this is all very interesting, but it is something where I feel like the next book that I choose on this subject is going to have to be even more narrow in scope and continue to narrow as we go. But in any case, it was interesting. The one issue that I have with kind of both of these is that having come from these specific lectures about early Ottoman history and about French history is that both of these choose to use the English names for most of the Christians and a split of the English names and Arabic names for most of the Muslims, which means that if you are used to hearing the French and Turkish names, it's a little confusing. So I don't know if that has an impact on anybody other than me because I did listen to these specific lectures beforehand, but just something to be aware of going into it. So before and kind of concurrently, I was also taking part in a group read of the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley that Kazan from Always Doing was running. In addition to us, she had Alba from Seriella, Brian from Bookish, Cynthia from Book Whimsy, Nashwa S, and Brianna from Brianna's Library, which ended up being a great discussion group because we discussed a lot of stuff that was kind of peripheral to the book. I think I ended up putting about 27 other books on hold at the library about topics that are not really directly related, but we ended up talking about a lot of social situations, and not even specifically in the US, also in Japan and Pakistan and Canada and whatnot. So it was just a great discussion group because everybody brought their own perspective on both the period in history, the political situation, the religious situation, and just the generational perspective that we all had, because we had quite a spread of ages too. So it was a great group discussion, which to me, I think, made me enjoy the reading more than I would have otherwise, because the book does have that feel of personal myth building to it, as a lot of autobiographies of this type have. So, and I think with a lot of that, especially there's a section involving kind of his criminal life pre-conversion and pre-prison, which is presented very dramatically in that kind of myth-building style. And I think had I been reading this on my own, I would have just skimmed through a lot of this. And so I think doing this as a group read just added so much to the experience. It was fantastic. Now, at the same time as I was reading that, I was also reading Manning Marable's Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, which is essentially written as a response to the autobiography, where it references it multiple times and then references other sources, pointing out where things might be true, where things might have happened slightly differently, what was exaggerated, what was left out. And then it moves on beyond the point of the autobiography and talks about things that happened after the death of Malcolm X and with the family and the estate and some of the kind of positioning in the common culture. So that was really interesting, again, as a pairing and as also as a discussion point with the group read. I definitely think it was a better experience reading this concurrently with the other book than either of them would have been if I had read them alone. That was quite interesting. I know there's a new biography that is coming out that has just been released, so I have that on hold at the library. We'll see when I get it. I feel like, can there be more to say after having read these? But we'll find out, I guess. Alright, what else do we have? We have some memoirs. Next up, I read a graphic memoir called Beirut 1990, Snapshots of a Civil War. This was written by Sylvain Bruno Richard and was drawn by Christophe Gaultier. It has a very rough pencil sketch style, and this details essentially a rather brief period in 1990 where these two brothers, who were quite young at the time, went to deliver medical supplies to an aunt who was a nun who ran essentially medical support during the Lebanese Civil War. And the two of them have this idea that rather than dropping things off, they're going to volunteer somewhere. And they have a lot of challenges finding places to volunteer. And on one level, I thought that was very interesting because I think a lot of people assume that they can do more when they're non-specialists coming from some other country, like, here, I'm here to save you, and you can't. But it doesn't really interrogate that particularly. Now, I mean, I think just having that happen is commentary on its own, but it does feel very slight. There isn't a lot else to this other than they attempt to help, they realize they can't really, and maybe the best thing they can do is tell the story. And I suppose this is them telling the story. When this was first published, the proceeds were going to charity, so there is an element of that to it. But reading the story, you do think, I have read much more interesting stories about both locals and outsiders in the Lebanese Civil War. It's just not that interesting. I don't know. It just made me think, why does this exist? Except that the proceeds went to charity, so it exists for that reason. But yeah. Right, and finally, I listened to the audio version of Austin Channing Brown's I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. This is a book that one of the celebrity book clubs has had, so it's everywhere. I listened to it exclusively because it was available now and I was looking for something of that length to listen to, and I hadn't actually realized the celebrity book club connection until afterward. In any case, this is a memoir in which the author kind of opens by, her parents gave her the first name Austin, in part because it was her grandmother's maiden name, but also because they figured that people would see that on a resume and assume she was a white man, and it would help her career-wise because she'd get invited to the interview at least. So with that opening, she then goes through basically a history of both her upbringing and her work life in a lot of very Christian situations in which the white and black racial divide within that kind of religious situation has a fairly major bearing on how people behave towards her. And her job is apparently working for a mostly white Christian organization, and so essentially she's being paid to deal with some of these issues. And in addition to the main chapters, she has regular asides that are essentially aimed at other black women working in mostly white Christian organizations, essentially. I thought this was very interesting, especially the difference in white churches and black churches in an American Protestant Christian context. That is not my religious background, so some of that was kind of over my head. Especially there are some parts where she's very specifically quoting things, and it didn't have a lot of meaning for me, but I think if you are from her same religious background, that will have meaning for you. In any case, I thought it was fascinating just the fact that she is in this career path that puts her in these situations more frequently than she would need to otherwise, even though this is something that is just innate in the fabric of how racial dynamics work in the US, I think. So it was interesting. I feel like I've read a lot of memoirs by Americans of the very similar age lately, and I actually realized I have another one out of the library now, and I think I'm kind of done with a lot of them, but this one did have a different angle. So yeah, there we go. Alright, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. If you've had any excellent group reads lately, I'd love to hear how they went. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.